Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2024 Agronomy in Action Insight Series. We want to thank you for joining the very first of 6 webinars that Golden Harvest is hosting via the agronomy team here this winter. This series really, the goal of the series is to bring forward key agronomic management practices to maximize your corn and soybean yield potential. Today, we will be covering a presentation from good to great, taking corn performance to new levels. With that being said, before we jump into content, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. The first is that we are recording this webinar, and it will be housed on the Agronomy in Action Insight Series landing page, which will get you that link following these webinars, but those will be posted about a week or two after the live event. Secondly, this is a webinar format, so we will take all of your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So get those posted throughout the entire presentation. We'll leave some time at the end to cover your questions, and anything that we aren't able to talk and kind of answer verbally, we will follow up over email. The last thing is we are offering CCA credit for your participation and your presence here during the webinar. We will have that QR code at the very end of the slide deck. So if you're looking for CCA credit, please plan to have your CCA app ready to scan that during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Today, we have 2 incredible speakers with us to talk around this corn performance message. We have Steve Wilkins, our agronomy manager for the Central Commercial Unit of Golden Harvest, and so that's the state of Illinois and Iowa. And then we have Brad Bernhardt, an agronomic research scientist here at Syngenta, who also resides in Illinois. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Steve to get us started here this morning on the webinar. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks, Julie. Appreciate that introduction, and good morning, everyone. Appreciate you taking a couple of minutes here on a Thursday morning to join our webinar and talk a little bit about a recap from this past year around corn performance, and a couple of items that we learned from our vantage point. Over the course of the next 60 minutes, there's really 2 main items that we want to spend some time focused around. And the first one is we want to give a little bit of a recap of where did the corn yield come from this year. In talking with many of you and many other customers, I think the yield surprised a lot of people. And I think there's some key factors that really help drive yield throughout the course of the year that we want to help explain a little bit. And then the second one is going to be, what are the management factors that we observed this year that we think we need to implement into our farming practices to help continue to drive corn yield as well as corn profitability going forward. So where do I want to start with this? 2023 really surprised on the yield front. USDA on January 12th released our yield average at 177.3 on the large acreage that we had. Our carryout production, 15.3 billion bushels, really surprised people. And through the course of most of the year, we were referencing through the dry May, June into July, like this is a 2012 type of crop given the weather that we had and stuff. But when the dust settled, we were about 50 to 55 bushels higher than that. So the drought monitor wasn't exactly correlating to what we had from a yield standpoint. One thing, if you're marketing interest like I am, years that end in 4 tend to be really high producing years. If you go back and you look at 1994, 2004, 2014, all records at their time, and now we're in 2024. So maybe it'll ring true again this year. We want to make sure we cover some practices that are going to help us raise big bushels here this year. So let's go back and talk a little bit about the weather. Okay, if we think about how 2023 unfolded, we were very, very dry in May. Okay, that led to very timely planting, very uniform emergence. We had pretty good stands here across the Corn Belt. Then as we got into June, it was dry. And I think a couple of things happened with the dry June. First and foremost, we did not lose fertility this year, specifically nitrogen, sulfur, our leachable nutrients. They maintained and they stayed on the soil profile available for our plant roots to go and get up. The second thing is we had deeper rooting. Odds are we access moisture and we access a deeper level of nutrition in our profiles that maybe we haven't gotten in previous years. A lot of people tell me I fertilize for 200, 200 and a quarter corn, and I'm pulling down 250, 275. Where'd that come from? That in part's part of where it came from. July was again very dry. Did not have a lot of disease this year. Certainly there's isolated pockets where we had some issues such as tar spot and some southern rust and stuff. But on the whole, across the Corn Belt, disease pressure was lower this year relative to most. And finally, we had a very timely rains during the grain fill process and the cooler nighttime temperatures. We'll dive a little bit deeper into that going on, but I think that was a real big driver for corn yield this year. So quiz question to help start us off here. 230 bushel corn crop, roughly how much on average, like how many inches of water do we need for that? So Julie has that up here. We'll give about 20, 30 seconds here for you guys and gals to answer that. But the options are we looking at 15 inches, 20 inches, 25 inches, or 30 inches to help us raise a really good yield? One of the items that is really important here as we think about how much water is needed is we have two sources of water, really. If we're not irrigating, we have it from our soils and we have it also that comes from rain. We want to really marry that stuff up and talk about exactly what happened here this past year. So we've got a good mix. Actually, we're pretty split between 20 and 25 inches. And Iowa State research and some stuff from the U of I would say that we need about 25 inches of moisture to raise a corn crop in that area. So let's talk about that and deep dive a little bit more. Okay, so the map that I'm showing here on the left-hand side of your screen comes to us from Sean Connolly at UW-Madison. And basically what it's showing is on our soils across the Midwest, what are our water holding capacities and what can we hold from a full soil profile? And you can see when we get into a lot of these blue, highly productive soils, I'm sure this is in millimeters, but if you're in the dark blue, you're able to hold roughly about a foot of plant available water. And in many instances, as we head into this growing season, we had full profiles. Now I fully realize that wasn't everywhere. We still had a lot of drought, but many instances, we got a good amount of the way to that 25-inch threshold from what our soils could hold. Okay, in addition to that, timely rains throughout the year. This is a map that we pulled from some Iowa State weather areas and look at where you're located. But if you take your soils and you add in what we got from a rain precipitation standpoint, you can start to add up and figure many of us got a lot of moisture for our plant to use, and this rain came very timely throughout the course of the year. So I think that was a large factor for us. Now, a couple of us were also talking about early on in the season, we had all of the smog, all of the smoke, a lot of stuff was happening from these wildfires. Certainly that had to have an effect on yield. And quite frankly, not only do we think and have some science to prove that it didn't have a negative effect on yield, on the contrary, we could argue that early in the growing season, the smog and stuff, it creates diffusion of light. Potentially, it could have even helped us. But regardless, we were losing less water due to evapotranspiration from our soils. If this smog happened during the grain fill process, I think we'd be talking very, very different. But since it was in the vegetative stages earlier in the crop stage, certainly we don't feel this had a large negative effect on yield this year. Again, potentially it helped us out a little bit. Okay, so that kind of neutralized it. Let's now talk a little bit about specifically weather. And we got a question here that we'd like to pose is, when you think about nighttime temperatures, at what's the threshold do we need to get over to really begin to see a decline of corn yield performance? And our options are 65 degrees, 70, 75, or 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So we'll give a couple of seconds here for you guys to submit your votes, and then we'll go through what some of our internal research as well as public research is saying as far as temperature and stuff goes. I think many of us, as we lived throughout the course of this year, we realized we never had prolonged excessive periods of heat. That was a key difference from what we had this year in 2023 relative to what we had previous years, like a 2012 type deal. So we're again pretty split. Got a few people at 70, a few at 75, and a few at 80. Okay, that's good feedback there. Wanted to start this conversation again by just showing across the Midwest the temperatures that we had this year. So this is not nighttime temperatures. This is just the deviation from normal. Okay, I think we've got like a 70-year baseline here. So the graph on the left is showing year-long, basically June 1 all the way through what we term black layer. And you can see, at least for the Eastern Corn Belt, we were below below temperature. Central Corn Belt, a lot of Illinois, we were also below from a temperature standpoint. And certainly as we went north, and as we went west, maybe we got a little bit more, but overall for the growing season, the temperature was very favorable. I think that's a key point where a lot of yield came from. The graph on the right is specifically during what we feel was the grain fill process. And again, it's the same trend, but we did not have at any point in time excessive heat throughout the course of the year. So what does that mean in terms of yield and the components that make up yield, specifically when it comes to our kernel size, our kernel weights, the duration of the grain fill process? This is some really nice research that our Golden Harvest Agronomy team published a little while ago, where it shows the effect of nighttime temperature specifically on yield. And you can see when we're getting nights below that 70-degree threshold is really where we want to be. To go back to our quiz question, our yields are really, really good. Okay, we have to get above that 70 degrees into that 80s to really start to reduce and pull back yield. And again, we didn't have that this year. Okay, that was a big contributing factor to yields, I think, really surprising to the upside. Specifically, our research is going to say about 3 to 4.5 type 5 bushels is what we decline for every degree Fahrenheit over 70. Okay, so that to me is one of the biggest takeaways. Yes, we were dry, but we did not have the combination of heat stress and moisture stress. And I think it really takes both of those to do some pretty sizable damage for yield across the Midwest here. So let's look at a couple of more things as far as the yield component. So when we think about where corn yield comes from, there's really three main areas that we're looking at. Okay, the first one is what's my population, my plants per acre. Second one is how many kernels per plant do I have? And finally, what is the weight of each kernel? And remember, kernel weight is not the same as test weight. Okay, that's very different. So some more research that we've been able to do and accomplish, we went back and we looked at our Golden Harvest hybrids over the years, is for 2023, what we observed is a lot of our yield came from kernel count, not exactly kernel weight. And if you look back the past couple of years, 2019, 2020, even into 2021, we could argue that a lot of yield was coming from the weight of the kernel. Well, last year and this year, again, we're actually seeing the count of the kernels add additional yield. Okay. If you think back to our dry May, our lack of disease around pollination, and then favorable rains later in the season to help us hold those kernels. Kernel count was a factor in driving yield this year. And I know that surprised myself, and it might surprise some of you too, but that's a little bit of what our research was showing. Now I want to show a slide too. When you look at specific hybrids from top to bottom in our lineup, this is some really quality work that our agronomy research team has done. When they go in and they look at specifically on a hybrid by hybrid basis, what's the kernel count for each of them. And you can see there's a very, very, very wide difference. But this helps us think contextually as we're planning our crop and our corn crop for this upcoming year. Okay, am I thinking about kernel size, kernel number? What's a hybrid that could fit that? Talk to your Golden Harvest agronomist. They know, they understand this information. They can help take this a little step further with and for you. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my counterpart, Dr. Brad Bernhardt, to take us to the next leg of this talk and look at really what was working here in 2023 to add and to drive yield. Brad, it's yours.
Good morning, everybody. Excited to be here this morning and talk to you a little bit about some of the management practices that we've seen this year and the impact they have on yield. So going to start here with a poll question. And the poll question is, which management practice had the largest impact on yield in 2023? Your options are a fungicide application, fertility, your planting density, or your hybrid selection. And we understand that it's going to be dependent on your environment, your geography, your soil type, and the location you are. So I hope to see quite a bit of different answers here. And then we'll go ahead and walk through some data that we've done this year and kind of answer some of these questions of what we've seen this year in our research trials. So as I was kind of expecting, a pretty split there. So hybrid selection was the most popular answer of what hybrid you pick, followed by fertility, plant density, and fungicide. So we're going to go ahead and walk through some research. The Golden Harvest partners with the University of Illinois and Dr. Fred Belo's Crop Physiology Lab to conduct trials to evaluate hybrids for their yield response to different agronomic practices. So they have 20 hybrids at each location. They operate at 3 locations in Illinois, from northern Illinois to southern Illinois. And we really look at 5 different management practices and also a combination of different management practices. So the 5 they look at is hybrid selection, fertility. Fertility is either the base fertility program of 200 pounds of nitrogen or a more enhanced fertility program, where they are broadcasting microessentials SZ and potash, which supplies roughly 80 pounds of P2O5, 60 pounds of potassium, 20 pounds of sulfur, and 2 pounds of zinc. They also look at foliar protection at the R1 growth stage, and that is a combination of Mirvis Neo fungicide and Warrior 2 insecticide. They plant everything at 2 different seeding rates of 34 and 42,000 plants per acre, and look at 2 different row spacings, everything in a 30-inch row compared to a 20-inch row. So the first slide here I'm going to show is the yield response to population this year at those 3 different locations. Again, the blue bar here is 34,000 plants per acre. The orange one is 42,000 plants per acre. And you can see at all 3 of those locations, we saw no yield response to the additional population up to 42,000. And 42,000 is an aggressive rate. And if you think about the year we had and it being so dry, I think that's a large contributing factor in why we didn't see a yield response at that higher density. But also, this is the average of 20 hybrids at each of these locations. And if you think about your average hybrid, typically the sweet spot is in the mid 30s for population. So 40,000 plus is just a little bit too aggressive here. But we also know that each hybrid has a different response to population. Some of them like to be planted and maximize yield potential in the low 30s, and some of them in the high 30s. And Steve's actually going to talk a little bit more about that here in a bit on the interaction between hybrid and plant density. So that was 2023. And if we look back the last 3 years, going back to 2020 on the response to population, it's kind of been a similar story at most of these locations in most of these years, where we didn't see a response on average to that 40,000 plus population. There were some examples in 2020 in Champaign and also in Nashville in 2021 where we did see a response to that higher density. But again, it's really environment dependent on that specific growing condition. So we'll move on here and talk about the response to fertility this year. Again, these would be averaged across the 20 hybrids at each of these locations. The blue bar is just that base fertility program of 200 pounds of nitrogen. And the red bar is when we added that microessentials SZ and potash broadcast. So all 3 of these locations, we saw a pretty good response, ranging from 6 to 9 bushels per acre. The one thing that I will note here is that both Champaign and Yorkville soil test levels will say that you do not need any additional P or K. Nashville was a little low on the P and K, so I likely saw a benefit to that, but both Champaign and Yorkville soil tests will say they are adequate, but still saw a good response. And I think a lot of that has to do with this year specifically is the potassium. We saw a lot of potassium deficiency across the countryside this year, mainly because of the dry weather. You need a lot of moisture to be able to take up and utilize potassium in the plant. So I think a large driving factor for this year was the potassium. If we look back on the previous 3 years, you can see in 2022, very large response to fertility. That was likely mostly driven by the phosphorus or sulfur in that particular year. And we don't know that for sure because it's kind of an all or nothing approach we're taking. We don't separate out each of the nutrients, but given the year, most of the time it's the P and K, or the P and the sulfur. That's the driving factor here. We'll jump into the response to foliar protection. The light blue bar, again, no foliar protection. The dark blue bar was when we added that Mirvis Neo fungicide and Warrior 2 insecticide. We saw a pretty good response at all three of our locations this year. And given the weather that we had at these locations, we saw very, very little disease pressure. So these yield responses are in the absence of any disease. And what's that showing you is the plant health effect from those fungicides and really prolonging the grain fill period for these hybrids. So this was in 2023. If we look back at the previous 3 years, you can see pretty good responses at all locations and in all years. But you'll notice that there's specific years and locations where we saw very large responses. For example, in 2020 in Nashville, we saw a 26 bushel response to foliar protection. That was largely driven by southern rust pressure at Nashville. So that fungicide really helped protect that plant. In Champaign in 2020 and 2021, the 14 and 13 bushel response had pretty big tar pressure that year at those locations. So that fungicide helped mitigate some of that detrimental effects from that tar spot. So one question that we often get asked is, do I need just a fertility or just a foliar protection, or do I need both? And the answer is both. And the reason it's both, if you look here, we show the response to just the fertility, just the foliar protection, and when you add both of them together. And you can see at all three locations, it's almost a perfect additive effect. If you add the response to fertility with the response to foliar protection, you get that response of when you add both of them together. And one of the reasons that we see that is because if you think about it, the fertility is really setting the foundation for the rest of the growing season. It's really setting that yield trajectory. And the foliar protection is really maintaining that high yield potential that you set early on in the growing season. So you really need to start off yield early and maintain that yield throughout the growing season with that foliar protection. So you really get your bang for your buck by applying both adequate fertility and that foliar protection. So they also look at narrow rows. They look at 30-inch rows compared to 20-inch rows. And so here's what it looked like the last 4 years at those 3 locations. And you'll see that there's quite a large range of responses from 3 bushels per acre to up to 36 bushel per acre response in those narrow rows. But you'll notice that on average, we see pretty good response to going down to a 20-inch row spacing. A lot of this is probably driven by the environment. So in certain situations or soil types, you'll see a lot larger response than others. Maybe in a drier year, you'll see can see larger responses than others. And I think a lot of that's driven by, we've done quite a bit of research looking at the root systems and different row spacings. And when you move to a narrow row, the root system gets significantly larger. And when you have a larger root system, you can be able to help mine nutrients and also water by having that larger root system. In addition, there's just better plant-to-plant spacing within a row in a narrow row system. So it's something to think about on your operation in the future if narrow rows would be a fit for your farm. So this slide here, we're looking at the orange bar is just your standard. And in this case, it was a 30-inch row at the low plant population, no fertility, no fungicide. Compared to that orange bar is going all in. So that's a 20-inch row, higher plant density with the fungicide and the foliar protection. So you can see that we saw large responses to that more progressive program this year at all 3 locations. And the one thing that I want to point out is that, well, number one, you'll notice that even in the higher yield environments, so at Champaign and Yorkville, we still see a significant response to that enhanced management. As a matter of fact, it's larger at the higher yield environments than at the lower yield environment of Nashville. So just because we're getting higher yields, 260, 270 bushels per acre, there's still yield to be gained by that enhanced management program. The other thing that I like to look at this graph and notice is that, these numbers with the progressive program, it's really showing that it's a systems approach. You can't just add one factor here, one factor there. You really need to have a systems approach where, again, you're setting that yield trajectory early in the growing season and then maintaining that yield throughout the rest of the season. So the last factor that we look at in these trials is hybrid selection. So again, we're looking at in 2022 and 2023 was the average of, or looking at 20 hybrids. In 2020 and 2021, it was actually 36 hybrids. And this is the range in yield among those hybrids at those locations. So for example, in 2023 at Yorkville, the yield difference between the lowest yielding hybrid and the highest yielding hybrid was 62 bushels per acre. So that just really just shows you that your hybrid selection specifically this year was the #1 factor of your yield potential. So you really need to get your hybrid selection right. One thing to think about here is at those 3 locations in 2023, if we had those same 20 hybrids and we ranked them in yield at Yorkville from 1 to 20, that ranking is going to change when we move to Champaign, because we know that hybrids like different environments or different management systems, different soil types. So we really need to be able to select and match the right hybrid on the right acre with the right management program. And that's really how you maximize your yield potential. And going to turn it back over to Steve, who's going to talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Brad. Appreciate that information. So I want to build upon what Brad just shared, and I would like to take some examples that Andrew Roop did in the state of Iowa this year with a handful of push-it plots on cooperators farms. So I got a map of Iowa up right now, and it shows the moisture throughout the state for the year. And we had some really dry areas in the state. We also had some that had some excess moisture as well. And we had a handful of plots in each of them. And I think we're going to see here a real nice microcosm of getting and matching the right genetics into the right area, and also how we can manage them. So one of the first ones that we're looking at here is a plot that was planted in an area that was not moisture deficit. And you could see I selected 3 hybrids here. Golden Harvest 11V76, a broadly adapted hybrid that's we've sold for years. And then some newer ones, 13B17, as well as our new 14B32. And you could see in a situation where things are good, hybrids did really, really fine. Okay, not a lot of difference. We'd probably expect this. Mid 30,000s, as Brad said, was pretty much getting some good yield and stuff as well. But we tend to see a trend to higher yield with the higher RMs. And, we picked up on the 14B, a nice yield average here across a couple of populations at just shy of 270 bushel an acre. Okay, we had another plot a little ways away, very comparable, not maybe quite as much moisture, but again, you're going to see a comparable type trend where you want it to be in that mid 30 range, planting full season corn, getting really good yields. Okay, but now we've also had 2 different plots in the really drought prone areas. And now you can start to see things change pretty quick. Okay, this is a situation where higher populations didn't necessarily always favor us. We did see that with the 11V76, but look at how the hybrid differences change. This is not a situation or a scenario where we'd want to put a hybrid such as 14B32. However, on the B17, we see consistent average performance both in the high and the low to moderate yield environment. And finally, we've got one more situation here around a 250 yield level, and you see the trends the same, not ultra high yield that we're pushing the 260, 270, 280s, and the product like 11V76 has come through. So the reason we put this up here is because we understand that Brad talked about how management practices as a whole are responding, but we all know that each and every hybrid has its own specific responses. So we've done these pushy trials last year. We're doing them again this year. We would encourage you to talk to your GHX specialist or your agronomist if this is something of interest to you. as we help to continue to find farms to put these on and work in the countryside to make sure that we get our product placement and stuff right. Okay, another way to look at this, I just broke this down again, hybrid by hybrid. So instead of trying to look across things, I thought it might be a little bit easier just to focus in on each of the 3 specific hybrids. And you can see they tell very, very different stories, and where we place them and how we place them really can make or break the experience that we have on our farms, and for many of us with our customers. But on the whole, if I can summarize this, your higher yielding acres, your higher yield environment, moderate to maybe potentially a little bit higher populations, great opportunity for 14B32. On the flip side, if we've got some stress going on and some variability, again, that's an acre that 11V needs to really reside on. Then we've got a new product in 13B17 that showed us real strong, real competitive yields across both of them as well. A little bit higher population. So we enjoy doing this work. And again, if it's of interest to you, we'd highly encourage you to reach out and talk a little bit about us on the agronomy front and the Golden Harvest GHX group to get these on your farm. So one component of yield that we wanted to continue to talk and drive home, we do this almost every year, is around relative maturity. Okay. For years, you've heard myself, my counterparts talk about each RM is worth statistically about 2 bushels an acre. And we ran the data again this year, and what do we see? Very comparable information. So if you're interstate 80, we kind of use that as a dividing line. If you're south of there, again, our regression lines are the same year over year. Plant fuller season products where and when it makes sense. If you're going out and you're planting 115-day corn relative to say 105 because you want to get going early for harvest or something, just understand mathematically when that seed hits the soil, there's a 10 bushel yield hit against it. If you're north of Interstate 80, getting into the northern climates, the number isn't quite as high, but it's still 1.5 bushels. So I'd encourage you, if you're planting a 90-day corn, maybe you look at a 95. We had a great advancements class this year in the 100-day range. So group who're planting 90-day, maybe be looking at 100, 102, 103. We really see that's a continued driving factor to add yield. That's very consistent, very repeatable year over year over year. Okay, why is some of that? This is a great chart from agronomy research that was done here about 2 years ago, and so much of it goes back to the grain fill process. Okay, Brad did a really nice job talking about how the matchup of the fertility with the fungicide was driving yield. I think a huge component of that is because we get more days of grain fill. So we can do that from a management standpoint, but you can do it also with a hybrid that you pick and you choose. And you can see here going from 100-day all the way up to 115, 116 full season corn, you're getting in the ballpark of up to 20 more days of additional grain fill. So if you have that, we got to protect it. You can really drive a lot of incremental yield. So I understand we've got people from this call all over the Midwest. Know your area, but also be thinking about, am I leaving yield and opportunity on the table by the hybrids I select, and be thinking about relative maturity as well. Okay, now when we talk about relative maturity, everyone's always like, well, what about planting date? Okay, this is a great graph again that we've got here from our agronomy research group. The simple thing is don't even consider switching hybrid maturities up through the middle of May. Once you get into the May 20th, maybe it should start to enter your mind, but realistically, you got to be into the last week of May before you really take a concrete effort to switch to an earlier RM. And if and when you do, what our research would say is you're looking at about a 5-ish day RM change. So if you're planting 110-day corn, look at 105. 105, go down and look at a 100-day type deal. So a lot of times we fight emotion because things are getting late, we're stressed. Stay the course throughout the majority of May. Okay, that would be our take-home message when it comes to planting date and how it affects yield going forward. Okay, I want to start to conclude a few things around this. We got a couple of slides left. There's a lot of information on this slide. I really want to focus on 2 specific areas. The first one is what we're looking at here is basically a table of some of the work that Brad showed in graphs from the work that the University of Illinois has done with their management. I took a subset of this information. What I really wanted to show you, just continue to ingrain this in our minds, is that the addition of fertility with foliar protection pays. Okay, so what I've outlined here is statistically, when we marry these things up, we should have confidence this is a winning opportunity for us to add bushels on our farm. Okay, what's also of interest here, next graph or box that I highlighted, is in the statistical sciences, it's very, very challenging to get three-way interactions. Okay, that doesn't happen a whole lot. And what we found this year is even with all the challenges we had, weather-wise, dryness, you name it, we have instances where if you're doing population, fertility, higher management, and you marry it all together, it's been working out. And I would not have expected that this year, given the weather and stuff that we had. So what this all boils down to means is we just continue to see, in many cases, a higher level of management win. Now, what I want to really draw our attention to is one of those specific locations in the previous graph was Northern Illinois, Yorkville location. And this is kind of a microcosm of everything we've been talking about. Highlighted here 2 of our Golden Harvest products that were in the test that Dr. Fred Bilo did. And what you can see is fuller season genetics, a little bit maybe north of zone where people would traditionally want to consider planting, 115 type day corn, highly managed. In a narrow row system, we're 30 to 40 bushels above the plot average, talking 320 to 335 bushel corn yields. That's dry land this year. That's really good. And I think that's something we can all consider is I don't know how much drier it's going to get future years, but to be able to get those yield levels through high management in 2023, really, really, really strong. And that's the combination of doing everything right. Okay, now I get this question all the time, and I'm absolutely certain a lot of you might be out there rolling your eyes, be saying, "Well, does it pay?" And like my job is to try to get yield potential to you, our customers. And your job is to say, well, I need to be solvent and ROI positive. And that's part of why we continue to do a lot of work with precision planting at their PTI farm in Pontiac, Illinois, because they're all about yield and ROI. They do their top 10 and their bottom 10 in every year as far as economics goes. And I think for all of us, you've seen this over the years. 15J did really well on that farm a couple of years ago, 350 bushel yield. This year, we put 14B32 on the farm. And this is a graph that was shared with me from Jason Webster, where in the high yield area, again, we're over 350 bushel. You can see there's some nice competitors in the marketplace there, but very high yielding product. So does this pay? Does this yield? Now, here's a clip and a snip that Jason passed along to me, and I'll just read it for you. It says Golden Harvest 14B32 obtained ridiculous yield levels at 305 and 300 and call it 54 bushels. The response to this corn is amazing in high management situations. Both agronomic and economic optimum seeding rates were achieved at 38,000 with an advantage of 48.2 bushels per acre and an economic return of, let's just call it $54 an acre. Okay, so what I really appreciate about the work that Jason does is he's taking all of this stuff and he looks at the economics very black and white. And what he continues to tell us is, yes, managing for higher yield continues to pay. Every farm is different. We all know and understand that, but it's nice to see this saying, yeah, if you're going to put the ends to justify the means, we fully expect it to be more ROI responsive as well. Okay, so with that, we're going to pivot now a little bit. We're going to turn it back over to Dr. Brad Bernhardt, and he's going to take us through some more of the local things that we've been doing across agronomy research and agronomist teams here across the Corn Belt. So Brad, over to yourself.
Yep, I'll wrap it up here with just one last study that we've been working on for the last couple of years. And we work with the Golden Harvest agronomists and local farmers to implement genetic by environment by management trials. These are full field strip trials. And really the idea behind them is just to better understand how hybrids respond to enhanced management. So there's usually a couple different hybrids in these trials, usually between 4 to 10 hybrids. And it's pretty simple. We just have a standard management program, and that standard management program is just whatever is typically done in that given geography. When we compare that to an enhanced system, and that enhanced system is just is really just that, putting some enhanced management practices out there, usually focused on additional fertility with the planter or additional side dress, maybe some foliar fertility, also probably additional nutrients with the side dress, adding that fungicide, foliar protection, things like that. Sometimes it can even go as far as adding additional biologicals or humic acids, those type of products as well. So it's really just trying to compare that enhanced management compared to standard management. And those dots there on that map in blue were the locations we did in 2022, and in the orange were 2023. So here's just some of the visual responses we saw this year. Here's a location in Iowa. You see those 4 hybrids there. And at this particular stage, when these photos were taken, the only difference between the enhanced and standard practice was a pop-up starter fertilizer was added to the enhanced system. And so you can see that all 4 of those hybrids are responding very well to that pop-up starter fertilizer. I like to look at that. I like to look at that G03B19, and in that enhanced system, that plant there on that right, you can see it's throwing a tiller. Compared to in the standard system, you don't see any tillers on those plants. And I like to think of tillers is if you see those in your field, it means you have happy plants. That's really what a tiller is telling you. I don't necessarily like to see tillers get large or see them later in the season, because that means your plant is probably a little bit too happy and that you probably didn't plant enough plants and limited your yield potential on not having enough plants out there. So tillers are good early on, but not necessarily want to see them late in the growing season or get very large. Here's another picture. This is at a different location in Iowa, 4 different hybrids there. And at this particular growth stage, when these pictures were taken, the enhanced system had an additional starter fertilizer, a sugar added, a fulvic acid, and a fungicide all applied in furrow. So that's what the enhanced management system here is. And you can see very good growth enhancement for all 4 of those hybrids. Some of them responding a little bit better than others. Another location in Iowa, these are looking at the ears here, comparing a standard versus enhanced system. You can see how these hybrids are responding a little bit differently. Some of them, specifically the G11B76, probably putting a little bit more kernels on at the end there, a little bit bigger ear. While some of them, maybe that G10B61 is getting a little bit more girth in that ear, compared to, or similar to that G07, G73, a little bit more girthy ear and also a little bit bigger ear for that specific hybrid as well. So hybrids can flex in different ways, whether that's ear length, kernels around, or even kernel depth. Here's another picture. This was at our St. John, Minnesota location where we're doing these trials. So these 2 pictures were taken on the exact same day. The crop was planted the exact same day, and we're looking at the same hybrid here. So the only thing different is the management. And you can see with that enhanced management system, we not only have the crop is a growth 1 or 2 stages ahead, but also about 12 to 16 inches taller. I mean, you can see that picture on the right there. It's almost canopied compared to the standard management. Still has quite a ways to go there. The enhanced system at this location was really focused on fertility. So additional nutrients applied with the planter, side dresser, some foliar nutrition as well, and also additional foliar products, including some biostimulants and some fungicide as well. Here's what those ears look like at that location a little bit later in the growing season. There's a couple things that stick out to me here. And again, it's kind of how these hybrids flex. So if you think about at that top right there, the 00A97, those ears definitely got a little bit bigger with that enhanced management system. Compared to that 01B63, really the enhanced system helped maintain those kernels. So you can see in the standard system there, we started having some kernel abortion going on. This was a very dry location, but in that enhanced system, we're able to maintain some of that yield potential, hold on to those kernels. If you look at that G98B99, that bottom left there, the thing that sticks out to me is the consistency of ear size in the enhanced system compared to that standard system where the ear size is a little bit more up and down compared to more consistent in that enhanced system. So let's look at some yield results. So I've got all the locations that we've done these trials at the last 2 years in 2022 and 2023. And you can see that there is a large range in response that we've been seeing to these enhanced management systems. So some locations we've only been seeing about 5 to 7 bushel response, and some we've been seeing up to 35 bushel response. And the degree of response that we're seeing is really based on a couple different things. So the location or the environment that we're at, all these locations have different hybrids. So the hybrids that are in these trials, and then also the degree difference between the standard and enhanced management system, because again, they all have a different system. So the degree on how enhanced that system is really showing up here on the level of response that we are seeing. So I'm just going to focus in on 2023 at some of our locations and break it down to a hybrid level. So these are the 3 locations in Iowa this year. At Charles City, really those 4 hybrids had very similar responses to that enhanced system at that particular location. Compared to St. Ansgar, Iowa, you'll notice that 97B had 11 bushel response, compared to, if you think about that 01B, only a 1 bushel response to that enhanced management. So that 97B was much more responsive than that 01B. And compared to that Sumner, Iowa location, you'll see that 3 of those 4 hybrids had a very similar response. Just that 07G tended to be less responsive than the others at that location. Here at St. John's, Michigan, where we're just showing you those photos, a much more responsive location. And again, here, that 97B, one of the most responsive hybrids at this location, compared to that 01B, a little bit less responsive. And then that 03B, that hybrid on the right there, 18 bushel response, was kind of fell in that middle of the pack of about an average response. So the last 2 locations here, I want to point out a lot more hybrids at these 2 locations. Kind of want to just point out 2 things here. Number one, if you look at each of those individual locations, those hybrids are listed in order of relative maturity. And you'll notice that as you go to the right of each of those locations, you'll see that the yield potential increases, kind of just showing you visually of what Steve was just talking about. You're starting to maximize the relative maturity for each of those locations is where you're really going to start getting your yield potential. The other thing I want to point out is that Malta, it was a very high yielding location, still saw good response to the enhanced management. But if you look at that G14B32, we were achieving over 300 bushel per acre with that hybrid matched with the right enhanced management system. Similar to that G11B76, very, very high yield potential for those 2 hybrids. Not only matching it with the high yield environment, but also that enhanced management system as well. So I just want to break it down and we have all these hybrids across all these locations, and not every hybrid is at every location. So you can't just look at the average response of these hybrids, because it wouldn't be a fair comparison. So one way we look at this is we're just going to look at 3 different hybrids here as an example. So for this G97B68, that hybrid was at 2 locations. And those bars is the response to the enhanced management. The orange bar is of just that hybrid. So at St. Ansgar, that hybrid had an 11 bushel per acre response to the enhanced management. That black bar is the average of all the other hybrids in that trial at that location. So on average, all the other hybrids only saw a 5 bushel per acre response to the enhanced management. So that particular hybrid was more responsive than the average. Similar story goes for St. John's, Michigan, more responsive hybrid than all the other hybrids at that location. And then if you average those 2 locations together, 97B had a 19 bushel per acre response to the enhanced management, compared to all the other hybrids were only averaging about 11 bushels per acre. So what you can say about that hybrid is, on average, it is a more responsive hybrid than the other hybrids. So and another example is the G03B19. That particular hybrid was at 5 locations. And if you look at the orange versus the black bar, you'll notice that that particular hybrid was kind of fell on average similar to all the other hybrids in that trial. And if you look at the average there, 13 bushel per acre response compared to a 12 bushel per acre response, you can say that hybrid on average responds similarly to all the other hybrids. In comparison, that last hybrid there, G01B63. It was at 3 locations, and at all 3 locations, that hybrid was consistently responded less than all the other hybrids in those trials. So that doesn't mean that hybrid doesn't respond. It just typically responds less than other hybrids. So just some key take-home messages from these trials that we do is that, well, the first thing is that, even under high yield environments, we still see yield increases to these enhanced management systems. And it just shows you that, many farms still have untapped yield potential that can be achieved through better crop management. We also really highlighted here that hybrids respond differently to these enhanced management systems. And the goal of these trials is really to narrow in on how to place and manage hybrids specifically for each individual hybrid. Now, one thing I want to point out is in these trials, we are really trying to push the crop with these more progressive programs. And that's not necessary for everybody. It's really the key here is to focus in on limiting your limiting factors and manage based off of those limiting factors, whether that's fertility or foliar protection. If you're really solid in those areas, maybe the next step is to implement a biostimulant or a biological product would be your next step. And I do want to point out that we are always looking for more locations for these G by E by M trials. So if anybody is interested in participating in these trials, please reach out to your local agronomist or sales rep, and we can get you set up to help implement some of these trials next year on your farm. So my last slide here is just kind of to wrap up this whole presentation as a whole. So we first kind of started talking about the growing season and in particular the weather. And, despite a very dry year in most of the Corn Belt, we saw very good yields. And it kind of shows you that it's more of the timing of the moisture and heat stress that determines the impact on yield, whether more than the degree of dryness or heat. I really hope that we hit home on how hybrid selection really matters, and also how Golden Harvest is really committed to understanding our products to help place our products to give you guys the best success on your individual farms. And that last point there is just kind of goes back to the last couple of slides I was just talking about, that even under these high yield environments, if you implement some higher levels of management, that's really where we start to see these high yield potentials. That's all I have. I will turn it back over to Julia to wrap us up.
Awesome. Thank you, Brad, and thank you, Steve. What an informative 50-some minutes that it has been, with some great data shown as well. We're going to now transition and answer some of the questions that have come in throughout the presentation. If you have any additional questions, please get those posted. So we'll go ahead and get started here. One of our first questions is, have there been any studies done on fixed versus semi-determinate ear hybrids as populations increase or as row spacing decreases? So Brad, I'm not sure if you want to hit that one.
Yeah, we do many studies looking at ear flex and hybrid flex at different populations. Just within our lineup, we definitely have some very fixed ear hybrids that, to maximize the yield potential of those hybrids, you just need more plants out there. The ear is not going to be flexing for you. Compared to other hybrids in our lineup, we have very flexed eared hybrids where the ear size really will change depending on the population you're planting at. So within the agronomy research team, that's probably the area of focus that we focus on the most.
Great, thank you. Then Steve, there's a question around nighttime temperatures when it comes to actual kind of where the yield is coming from. Any chance you can expand on that in terms of the length of time for specific temperatures?
So length of time, meaning like hours within a night or nights consecutive? Because I think there's a lot of difference there.
Yeah, the question alluded to kind of both. Is it one or the other? I guess would maybe be one way to answer.
Yeah, I mean, the research that we show is it was what 2.7 to 4.5 bushels per night potential loss every time we're over 70 degrees. So if you've got a week stretch, and this past year, while we were overall cool for nights, for most of the central Corn Belt, we had a week in August where we were above 70 degrees, and that cost us yield. But within a night, I couldn't tell you if we hit 70 degrees for, midnight to 2 a.m., how much is that costing us? I appreciate whoever asked the question. If you reach out, I'll try to hit it one off on you, but I don't know that answer. I'd probably be interested to know that myself too.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. Another question here. At all those locations, Brad, where you studied advanced management practices, was the fertility levels high to begin with? Or what was the standard?
So, I mean, it depended on the location, but in general, a lot of times we see fertility levels that say that they're adequate and we don't need additional P and K, but yet we're still seeing responses to additional fertility. And done a lot of work in this area. And I guess one of the take-home messages I would have is that your soil test is not always going to predict whether you're going to see a response to additional fertility.
I would add to that too, Julia. We could give a whole day's talk around fertility with corn management, but a lot of our soil tests were created a long time ago, not necessarily for the yields that we're getting today. So I think it's of interest. A soil test might say don't do something, but we continue to see situations where it is and it has been paying both in terms of yield and economics. So just encourage people to really understand your soils and your fertility. And our trend is simple. We continue to see responses to it.
Brad and Steve. Another question here. Have you done any work with phosphate availability products such as Nutrients Altura to enhance yield when added to starter fertilizer?
Yes, we have. Good question. So the agronomy research team, we do all different kinds of studies on agronomic topics. Actually, this past year, we had a phosphorus availability study specifically. We're actually using Avail T5, so we weren't using the one mentioned. But we do look at different nutrient enhancing products year after year. And I do want to call out that all the information and results from all of our trials that we do end up in the Golden Harvest Agronomy and Action Research Summary book. So look for that coming out here in the end of February. So all the results of all of our other trials and actually everything that we talked about today will end up in that book that you can see.
Great. Another question around your trials, Brad. For populations shown, were those planting populations or final stand populations?
So they were, I mean, the given numbers that I was showing you were the planting populations, but the final stands were always very close to that, within 1,000 to 2,000 plants per acre. We typically make sure when our trials are planted that they're in good condition, so we get the stand that we're looking to achieve.
Great. And this is one final question, and then we will wrap for the morning. Were there any no-till situations during any of these studies? What management strategies may make the largest impact on yield for no-till? Would any early season strategies make more of an impact?
So some of these were no-till and some of them were even strip-till situations, just depending on the location. But I would say that through some of our research that we've done, a lot of these management practices, in particular early season fertility or fertility applied with a planter, is only more important in no-till situations. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Just soils are a little bit cooler in no-till situations, and also you can get some stratification when you're applying broadcast fertilizer. So if you're banding that with a planter close to the row, you get more available nutrients early in the season. So yeah, these practices become even more important in a no-till situation for sure.
Awesome. Brad and Steve, thank you so much for your time this morning. It was a really informative hour. I also want to thank everyone that submitted questions. If you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to your local Golden Harvest agronomist or sales rep, and they can get you connected with others to answer your questions / get you one of those research guides that Brad was referring to. So That concludes our call today. We will have another one of these informative hours next Thursday morning as well on soil health. So we look forward to seeing you there. In terms of how to join the webinar, if you struggled this morning, there should be a reminder email that comes out on Wednesday that also has the link. But we will be utilizing the same link for all 6 webinars in this series. So appreciate it. Have a good and safe Thursday, and we look forward to seeing you next week.